All right, so we're going to do a review of all the quadratic key features that we've been talking about the past few days. So we're going to start looking at just a basic graph, and then we're going to work up to the equation, which is essentially the same except for you're actually going to have to calculate the axis of symmetry and the vertex. So when I look at this problem, the first thing it asks me to do, it says the parabola opens blank, so the a value must be. And so this parabola is going to open downward. And since this parabola is opening downward, that means that the a value must be negative. Okay, so that's something you need to know. If your a value is negative, it's going to open downward. If your a value is positive, it's going to open upward. So do we have a maximum or minimum? Well, the maximum or minimum is the vertex, and it's the point at the top, so we have a maximum. And our y-intercept, so the y-intercept is where it crosses the y-axis, so that's going to be 0, 0. And then we have the axis of symmetry. So the axis of symmetry is that invisible line that's going to split that quadratic parabola in half. And that is going to be at the line x equals, and it crosses the x-axis at -1. And yes, it does need to be an equation. It's going to be x equals because it crosses the x-axis at -1. Now, the vertex. The vertex is where that maximum is, which is at the point -1, +2. All right, so then we need to talk about increasing, decreasing, positive, and negative. So positive and negative are pretty simple in the sense that positive is when it's above the x-axis. So my graph began being positive at -2, and it stopped being positive at 0. So it's positive, so I'm going to do an inequality from -2 to 0. All right, and then we have our negative, so that's what's below the x-axis, and we have 2 of those. So for my x-axis, we have x is going to be less than because it's going to the left. So we have x is less than -2, and we have it going to the right side. So x is going to be greater than 0. So again, using these points right here are going to be key in doing your positive and negative, because that's going to be where it transitions at that x-axis. All right, and then we have our increasing and decreasing. So for increasing, we are going to read that from left to right. So when I read my graph from left to right, I'm going to be looking, so from the left, don't look at the arrows, we're going to move from left to right, we're going up, so we're increasing. So if I'm increasing, that means that it's increasing until it hits this vertex. And that vertex, remember, has an x value at -1, 2. So we're going to use that -1 because it's where the x value stops here. Okay, so that's where it stopped increasing. So we're going to say that x is increasing when it is, so it's going to the left side, so it's less than -1. All right, and now we're going to do the right side. So as we continue going to the right side, we're going down, so we're going to be decreasing. So if we're decreasing, that means that we're going to the right side, so it's going to be greater than -1. All right, so there's that particular. This is also going to be N-shaped, and the reason it's N-shaped is because it's shaped, the a value is negative going downward. And in this example, it's going to open downward as well. And since it's opening downward, my a value must be negative. This is also going to be N-shaped. So we're going to have a maximum, and our y-intercept is going to be at the point 0, -6. And I have a axis of symmetry at the x value of x equals -2 because it crosses the x-axis at -2. Now my vertex is located at the point -2, 2. And just as we talked about in the videos, your axis of symmetry is an x value. That x value should max the x value of your vertex. All right, so increasing. So again, let's do some increasing and decreasing. So we're going to go from left to right. So from the left, we are increasing. And that is on the left side. So that's going to be x is less than, and this point right here is -2, 2. So we're going to use the -2, the x value. So it's increasing on the interval x is less than -2. All right, and then we're going to continue, and it's going to decrease. And as it's decreasing, that means that my value is decreasing when x is on the right side. So it's going to be greater than -2. And now we need to do positive and negative. So I'm going to do some erasing here so we can see everything that I'm looking at. All right, so for positive, so remember positive means that it is above the x-axis. So for my positive values, I'm going to be looking at from -3 to -1, okay? So from -3 to -1, my x values are positive because it's above the x-axis. And then below the x-axis, I have two separate pieces. So below the x-axis where it's going to be negative. So on the left side, it's going to be negative when x is less than, because it's going to the left, -3. And it's also negative on the right side when x is greater than -1. All right, so we have another example here. This time the parabola is opening upward, so therefore since it's opening upward, we know that the a value must be positive. All right, so this time my vertex here is going to be a minimum because it's at the bottom of the graph. My y-intercept is going to be at 0, -3. And my axis of symmetry is located at x equals -1. And my vertex is located at the point -1, -4. All right, so let's talk about some increasing and decreasing because it's going to change this time because I have a graph that's opening upward. All right, so if we go from left to right, so from the left, we are actually going to be decreasing first this time. So since we're decreasing first this time, that means that we're decreasing until we hit our x value of -1. So remember, this is the x value of -1. So x is going to be less than -1 for decreasing. And then we're going to begin increasing again. So as we begin to increase, that's going to be on the right side. So that's going to be greater than. So it's increasing when x is greater than -1. So that axis of symmetry really is the split between increasing and decreasing, that x value for the axis of symmetry. All right, and then finally, we're going to do our positive and our negative. So our positive this time, when we're looking at our value, our positive is actually sectioned into two pieces. So my positive section is when x is less than -3 and when x is greater than 4. All right, and then our negative side this time is when it's below, so that's all one piece. So it's below the x-axis when x is between -3 and positive. Sorry, it's actually between -3 and 1. And let me correct this one over here. X is greater than 1. I don't know where I got 4 from. So when x is greater than 1, this side over here in pink, that is going to be positive. And when it's below the x-axis, it's between -3 and +1. All right, so those were all when the graph was given to us. So now let's look at an equation. So with my equation, the first thing I always like to do is I always like to identify my A, my B, and my C. These are all key features that we're going to be looking at. So my parabola is going to open upward, and it's going to open upward because of the fact that A is positive. All right, and since it's opening upward, so I kind of like to do a little graph of myself, or graph myself. I can see that I'm going to have a minimum here because it's opening upward. My y-intercept, remember, is going to be my C value, so that's going to be 0 and -3. And then my axis of symmetry. So my axis of symmetry is that value that goes through my vertex that splits it in half, but we have a formula for that. We have x equals -b/2a. So x equals -4 over 2 times 2, which is going to be -4 over 4. And x equals -1. So my axis of symmetry is that x equals -1. Now my vertex is going to be the axis of symmetry, and then we're going to plug in the x value. And that's going to give me my point for this is my x, this is my y. So what we're going to do is we're going to take that -1, and we're going to come over here and we're going to plug it in for x in the problem in both spots. So this is going to be 2 times -1, make sure you put in parentheses, squared, plus 4 times -1 minus 3. And that's going to give me this y value that I'm looking for in order to make my quadrant. Because right now, my vertex, I know the x value. The x value is -1, and I know it's -1 because it is the same as the axis of symmetry. So I'm going to go to Desmos, and I'm going to plug all this in. So I have 2 times -1 squared plus 4 times -1 minus 3. And we get -5. So my y value in this problem is equal to -5, which is going to be the y value of the vertex. Now, I'm going to go ahead and go back to Desmos, and I'm actually going to graph this problem. And here's my graph. Now, I can click that vertex, and I can see that I did get it correct. It's -1, -5. I can also graph my axis of symmetry, x equals -1, and there's my axis of symmetry. I can click the y-intercept and see that my y-intercept is at 0 and -3. These are all things that I can determine not only by doing it algebraically, but I can determine it by looking at the equation. Now, increasing. So when I look at my problem here, I can see, I have my general sketch, and I can see that it is increasing, or excuse me, we're actually decreasing first. So we're decreasing until we get to the axis of symmetry. And if you remember, the axis of symmetry is equal to -1. So therefore, we are going to be decreasing when x is less than -1. And then we'll begin to increase as we continue. So this time, x is going to be increasing when it is greater than -1. Now, for positive and negative, for our purposes, we're really going to have to use Desmos for this. And the reason I say that we're going to need to use Desmos is because we need to find those x-intercepts. And these x-intercepts are not very pretty. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to screenshot them and put them into our document. All right, so here's my graph that I had, and I can see that it's positive on the two sides. So therefore, we have x is positive when it is less than, we'll say negative 2.581, and it's positive when x is greater than 0.581. And then we're going to have negative. So it's going to be negative underneath the x-axis, and it's going to be negative when it's between those two values. So we have negative 2.581, and we have 0.581. So it's going to happen, and it's going to occur between those two. So we have to put x in the middle. All right, and for this last problem, so this time, this one's a little bit different because we have an a value that's negative 3. We have a b value that's 6, but we don't have a c value. If we don't have the c value, it's automatically going to be 0. So my parabola is going to open downward. And it's going to open downward because my a value is negative. All right, so if it's opening downward, here's my graph, and I'm going to have a maximum because we're going to have a point at the top. My y-intercept is going to be my c value, so it's going to be 0, 0 because our c value in this problem was 0. And our axis of symmetry, so x equals negative b over 2a. So x equals negative 6 over 2 times negative 3. So we have negative 6 over negative 6, so my x value is going to equal 1. So I know I have an axis of symmetry at x equals 1. And again, I can go ahead and graph this and look at it if I'd like. Y equals negative 3x squared plus 6x. And I can see that I have an axis of symmetry at x equals 1. All right, so now we need to find the vertex. Now remember, we already know part of the vertex. We know the x value of the vertex, and that's because we know the axis of symmetry. So we're going to use my axis of symmetry, and we're going to plug in. So we know that this is my axis of symmetry, and we're going to plug in the x value. So we're going to take our 1 that we got, and we're going to plug it in for x here and here. So if I were to plug this in, I get negative 3 times negative 1 squared, don't forget to square it, don't forget your parentheses, plus 6 times negative 1. All right, so I can plug all that in. So I have negative 3 times negative 1 squared plus 6 times negative 1. And sorry, it should be positive 1. All right, so if I plug this in, I actually plugged in negative 1 by accident. I'm going to plug in positive 1, and I get my y value is 3, which is exactly what the vertex says in Desmos. So if this equals 3, that means that my vertex is at 1, 3. All right, so increasing. So remember, we are going to read it from left to right. All right, so on the left, we are going to increase first until we see that x value of negative 1. So we're increasing when x is less than 1. And then we're going to be decreasing when x is greater than 1. All right, and then the last thing is the positive and the negative. And again, we're going to look at that in Desmos. So we need our x and y intercepts, which are at 0 and 2. So if I draw, I'm just going to take a quick little screenshot. And if I put this in, I can see right here that my value is positive between 0 and 2 because it's above the x-axis. So it's positive between 0 and 2. So it's going to be negative when it's below the x-axis. So it's negative when x is less than 0 and when x is greater than 2.